Welcome students to this discussion on Psychiatry INI-CET recall. Psychiatry is an important subject when you are preparing for any entrance exam, and this INI-CET is a very good example. You had almost about 9 to 10 questions coming in from Psychiatry, and most of these questions looked pretty easy for people to answer, at least most of the times. That's the problem with Psychiatry questions. Most of the times the questions could be easy, so if you don't answer it correctly, somebody else will move ahead of you by answering it correctly. So it's an extremely competitive world. Let's try to kind of understand what are the nitty-gritties of solving an MCQ and kind of how to approach the right answer when you have limited information with you and limited time with you. Let's take this question. A 40-year-old male patient comes to psychiatry OPD with complaints of having repetitive thoughts. Okay, he also says that his hands are dirty, though he thinks that it is not. He gets these thoughts that it is dirty. It also makes him feel very uncomfortable and makes him keep washing his hands. So with this information, you know what are you dealing with. Even without reading psychiatry, most probably you will think, okay, this guy is mostly suffering from OCD. That's something you know, obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Now the question is not about that. The question is whether it is a thought flow disorder, thought form disorder, thought content disorder, or thought possession disorder is what they have asked. So you need to know whether OCD belongs to which of these thought disorders. So there are basically 4 important types of thought disorders: thought form disorder, thought stream disorder, thought content disorder, thought possession disorder. Let me give you highlights of each of these things because they have also been separately asked in exams. When you're talking about thought form disorder, we are calling it as formal thought disorder. And the best example for formal thought disorder being seen is patients with schizophrenia. When you're talking about thought stream disorder, basically we are dealing with the flow of the thought, right? There are 2 important conditions very commonly asked in exams: prolixity of speech, which is seen in patients with hypomania, and another one is called as flight of ideas. Where do you see flight of ideas? Flight of ideas is seen in mania patients. Getting it? That's again asked in exams. So when you talk about thought content disorder, the best example is patients having delusions. So that's nothing but a thought content disorder. All your delusional disorder, patients with schizophrenia with delusional disorder, delusion symptoms, all come under this thought content problem. So where does OCD come? Now, if you look at Kaplan and Sadok says OCD is an example of thought content problem. But wherein majority of the mental status examination books will talk about OCD being an example of thought possession disorder. So I would go for OCD being a thought possession disorder. At least to my knowledge, when we have worked at NIMANS, we have been taught that OCD is an example of thought possession disorder. And most of the mental status examination books world over talk about it being a thought possession disorder, even though Kaplan and Sadok would give you OCD is a thought content disorder. So it depends on the source which the examiner might be going through, which you will never come to know. Now, so the answer for me is it's a type of thought possession disorder. The other classical example of thought possession disorder is seen in schizophrenia. It is called as thought phenomena. So what is this thought phenomena? There are 3 important thought phenomena, right? Thought insertion, which happens, thought broadcast, which happens, and thought withdrawal. So these are examples of thought possession disorder classically. Schizophrenia patients can have thought insertion, thought withdrawal, or thought broadcast. So look up on videos on schizophrenia and psychopathology for you to understand it in much more details. Like this, in this question, the answer for this question is very easy. If you look at it, it is possession. But the controversy is because of the Kaplan and Sadok talking about whether it's a content disorder, which because of majority of the books talking about it being a possession disorder, I think a better answer would be thought possession disorder, which is nothing but OCD. Now, let me highlight a few important points in relation to OCD, which is again asked in exams many times. You should know why is it called as a thought possession disorder. Now, what do you mean by thought possession? the thoughts which run in my head are under whose control? My control, right? The thoughts which run in your heads is also under your control. So the thoughts which run are under our own control. But what happens in patients with OCD is typically they have their own thoughts which becomes repetitive, which along with becoming repetitive, it is very distressing and unwanted. They don't want these thoughts, but it still keeps coming. It leads to significant disability. Because of these thoughts, there's a lot of disability which happens. That is what is typically thought obsession, right? Obsessive thoughts. Now, when these things happen, which is one's own thoughts which keeps coming repeatedly. For example, in this question, this guy is feeling, he's getting thoughts that his hand is contaminated, his hand is contaminated, his hand is contaminated. That repetitive thoughts, which is distressing, which is what is called as ego dystonic thoughts. This is again an MCQ which has been asked in exam. Ego dystonic thoughts. OCD is a very good example where you have ego dystonic thoughts. You are not okay with those thoughts. You don't want those thoughts. You feel very irritated about those thoughts. You feel it is unwanted thoughts. So that's very classical of patients with OCD, which is again going to happen, which is a very characteristic of OCD, thought obsessions. Now, what do you mean by compulsion? Compulsion could be both a physical or a mental act. It can be both a physical or a mental act. For example, in this question, what is given? He has thoughts that his hand might be contaminated. What does he do? He goes and washes his hands. This washing his hands is called as compulsive behavior, which is a physical compulsion. What could be a mental compulsion? For example, some of them with OCD, right, have images which come to them which distress them a lot. Let's imagine they get nude images about their own gods. So when they get these kind of images which are abnormal or unwanted, they feel very distressed about it. What they might do is they might start chanting some god's names repeatedly or telling sorry mentally 10 times, 15 times. So that becomes a mental act. If they physically do, it is called as a physical act. If they mentally kind of try to yield to those thoughts and kind of counteract with it, it is called as mental act. So compulsion can be both physical as well as mental. Again, compulsion is also repetitive. It is also distressing, and this is also disabling. So please remember, the importance of these thoughts are these. We all get repetitive thoughts here and there, but most of the time it's fleeting, it comes and goes. But in patients with OCD, it's kind of going to be there very significantly present, repetitive and disabling. That's what makes them suffer a lot and reach out to professional help. With this question, an important point you need to remember is they can talk to you about OCD, what is the nature of obsession, what is the nature of compulsions. They can also talk to you about what type of thought disorders are there, thought form, stream, content and possession. It's good to know each of the classical conditions which are related to these different types of thought disorders. They can ask you related questions to this. So let's move ahead with the next question. Which of the following antidepressants is associated with least sexual side effects? So they want to know in which antidepressant use there is least sexual side effects. Do you think mirtazapine? Do you think venlafaxine? Do you think imipramine? Do you think fluoxetine? What do you think is the answer? I hope you know the right answer. So let's reach to the right answer. When you're talking about sexual dysfunction, in patients with depression, the illness itself can cause sexual dysfunction by decreasing libido, right? Or sometimes it can cause a lot of anxiety in these patients, which can also lead to premature ejaculation. Sometimes because of extreme anxiety and those, they might not be able to have satisfactory erection, which can lead to erectile dysfunction. Now, depression itself can cause these symptoms. But we are talking about antidepressants causing further problems. When we are treating this depression with an antidepressant, sometimes some of these medications, some of these antidepressants can end up causing sexual side effects. What are the important sexual side effects which antidepressants? They can also decrease the libido. They can also cause premature ejaculation. They can also cause erectile dysfunction. They can sometimes also cause delayed ejaculation. Now, here is an important point. Because it can cause delayed ejaculation, there are two drugs. One is called paroxetine. Another drug is called depoxetine. Both these drugs are used as treatment for premature ejaculation. For patients with premature ejaculation, you can use these two SSRIs as treatment because they can delay the ejaculation. This side effect of delaying ejaculation becomes treatment here and can be used. That's again asked in exam, so it's good to know. So when you're talking about antidepressants, which antidepressants has less sexual side effects then? If at all a patient is very particular about sexual functioning and doesn't want to take an antidepressant which causes much of sexual side effects, then we need to think of these drugs. Bupropion is an important drug which has lesser sexual side effects. Another drug which is known is agomelatine, mirtazapine. These are important drugs. You can also add trazodone, which is also less known to cause sexual side effects. So there are two other drugs which is also spoken to cause lesser sexual side effects, but again, because they work on serotonin, they might still have a much higher potency compared to these drugs. Which are the other two drugs which are spoken about? One is called as vilazodone. Another drug is called as vortioxetine. So these are also drugs which are known to cause lesser sexual side effects. So what is the answer for this question? The answer would be mirtazapine, which is better choice compared to the other drugs. Venlafaxine is the dual-acting antidepressant which works on norepinephrine and serotonin, whereas imipramine is a tricyclic antidepressant, fluoxetine is an SSRI. So all of them has much higher potential to cause sexual side effects compared to mirtazapine. But what does mirtazapine cause? Two common problems. Do you know? One is increase in sleep, that is sedation. Another one is increase in appetite, which leads to significant weight gain. These are two common problems with mirtazapine. Moving to the next question. All of the following are types of subcortical dementias except. So you need to understand there are cortical types of dementia and subcortical types of dementia, right? So when you're talking about cortical type of dementia, we are talking about dementias which typically cause A symptoms. You would have seen the video on dementia, right, where I would have spoken about A symptoms, aphasia, alexia, agnosia, stereognosis. Those kind of symptoms happen in cortical types of dementia. Classical example is Alzheimer's disease. You also have the Pick disease, which is also called as frontotemporal dementia, which is an example of cortical type of dementia. Understood? Now, when you're talking about subcortical type of dementia, mostly we are talking about M problems, movement problems, motor problems. Movement and motor problems are very prominent when you're talking about subcortical types of dementia. So what are the important subcortical types of dementia you need to know? The important subcortical types of dementia you need to know are Parkinson disease, related dementia. Then you need to remember about supranuclear palsy, multisystemic atrophy, Wilson's disease, Huntington's, chorea. So these are all very important examples of subcortical types of dementia we need to know. So very commonly this question keeps getting repeated. So you need to answer this correctly. So all of the following are types of subcortical dementia except Pick's disease is a cortical type of dementia. Huntington's is subcortical, whereas Parkinson's is also subcortical. Wilson's is also subcortical. So what is the answer for this? Pick's disease is nothing but frontotemporal dementia, which is nothing but an example of cortical type of dementia. A very repetitive question which you need to know. Moving ahead, all of the following are good prognostic factors in schizophrenia except. So they are given a list, and this is kind of question which can keep getting repeated in multiple times, right, in exams. To answer this question, you need to know what are the good prognosis and bad prognosis for you to answer, right? One of the important factors you need to know, which is a good prognosis, is later onset. If anybody has later onset of schizophrenia, it means there is good prognosis. Again, next point, if schizophrenia develops after some significant stressful event or life event, some major life event or stressful event happens, after which the patient starts developing schizophrenia, it's a good prognosis. Acute onset is good prognosis. If the patient has lot of positive symptoms, then it is good prognosis. If the patient has lot of affective symptoms, what do you mean by affective symptoms? Mood symptoms, too happy, too sad. If they have affective symptoms or mood symptoms, then the prognosis is good. If the patients have good family support, it is good prognosis. If the patients are taking medications regularly and it doesn't cause much of side effects, then the prognosis is good. If the compliance to treatment is good, then the prognosis is good. If there is family history of mood disorder, the prognosis is good. If there is family history of mood disorder, the prognosis is good. Generally speaking, schizophrenia, if it's in a female gender, the prognosis is good. If it's in a female gender, the prognosis is good. Whereas what happens for bad prognosis, if it's a male gender, it becomes bad prognosis. If patients have schizophrenia history in the family, then it becomes bad prognosis. If there are a lot of negative symptoms, then it becomes bad prognosis. If the patient is into substance use and addiction problems, alcohol, cannabis, other substance use and all, then the prognosis becomes bad. If the patient has pre-morbid personality problems. What do you mean by pre-morbid personality problems or personality traits? Pre-morbid means illness. Pre-morbid means something which happens before the illness onset. If somebody is already having personality traits and abnormalities or some oddities in their personality traits, then they have much more worse prognosis compared to somebody who is absolutely normal before the development of schizophrenia. Excessive violence is a bad prognosis. Multiple admissions in hospital is also bad prognosis. So like that, you need to know what are the good and bad prognosis for you to answer this question. So go back to this question and tell me the answer now. All of the following are good prognostic factors except positive symptoms is good prognosis, later onset is good prognosis, insidious onset is bad prognosis, associated with depression is good prognosis. I told you, right? If the patients have a lot of mood symptoms, manic symptoms, depressive symptoms, then the prognosis is good. Understood? So it's important for you to remember a patient who is very disturbed, violent and agitated and psychotic, right? They might respond much better compared to somebody who is extremely withdrawn, apathetic and having a lot of negative symptoms in schizophrenia. Getting it? So moving to the next question, a 7-year-old presented with complaints of bedwetting. 7-year-old child presents with bedwetting problems twice a week, at least for the past 1 year. For a significant long time, at least twice a week, which is happening. So if bedwetting happens for more than 3 months, you diagnose enuresis, right? So here it is more than 1 year. A detailed investigation rules out organic causes. This is an important part of any child's investigation for bedwetting problems, right? You want to rule out organic causes, renal issues, anomalies and those things. What should be the treatment plan for this child is the question which has been asked. Do you want to give pharmacotherapy with imipramine? Do you want to do psychodynamic psychotherapy? Do you want to do bladder training with reward for delaying micturition during daytime? Bell and pad based classical conditioning. So what do you want to do is the question they've asked. Now the question is very clear. They've given you enough details to say you're dealing with something with enuresis problem and bedwetting problem. Now, they also said all the organic causes have been ruled out. So what do you want to do is the question they have asked. You need to understand a bedwetting problem, typically for you to diagnose the child has to be beyond 5 years of age. Here the child is 7 years, so you can diagnose enuresis. Next important point here is they're given all the choices and asked, what do you do? For that, you need to know how do you manage these patients with non-organic enuresis. So when you're talking about management, you need to understand, first of all, we want to deal with this bedwetting problem. Another thing you also need to understand is when patients come to us, already the damage has happened. They would have had bedwetting, but secondary to the bedwetting, they would have developed many other issues. They would have developed depression. Very commonly, they would have developed anxiety. Many times they would have also developed behavioral problems. Why behavioral problems? At home, the parents are very critical, constantly telling, oh my God, you keep wetting the bed, and they're angry at them, they scold the child, they kind of irritate the child. So the child starts telling lies, doing weird things, behavioral changes. All those are secondary problems with which children come, not just with bedwetting issues many times. So as a psychiatrist, our job is to find out whether the bedwetting problem is the only problem which is going on, or secondary depression, anxiety, and other behavioral problems have come in. Why this is important is because the first initial step would be psychoeducation. You want to educate about this problem. You want to tell the kid as well as the parents that it is not the kid wantedly doing it. The kid is not doing because it is lazy. The kid is not doing it because the kid wants to trouble everybody. It might be something which is happening beyond the kid's control. In fact, we need to say how development could be very different and it could change the trajectory in different people. And we need to say sometimes in the neural circuits to mature might take its own sweet time. So when you're clinically dealing with a non-organic enuresis, an important aspect is psychoeducation. You need to educate the child as well as the parent about the nature of the problem. Once you educate them, giving simple tips on bladder management are very, very useful initial steps. Now, studies show that it is not very effective when you delay maturation and those things and all, but it is good to talk to them about good habits to follow in terms of bladder management, which is an important initial strategy which is to be looked at. After that, you also need to follow a very good reinforcement strategy. Please understand, a lot of times because of the bedwetting problem, right, the parents and the child would have got into a lot of tussle and problems and criticality, scolding, beating, all this kind of stuff. So you want to do a healthy reinforcement strategy. A simple star chart could be very useful. So what is basically done in the star chart? In the calendar, if the dates are there like this, next to every date, the child can be asked to put a sun. If the child was dry on that day, the child can draw a sun next to that date. If the child had done bedwetting on a particular day, maybe an umbrella with rain. So that's something which figuratively tries to rewire and kind of give feedback to the child to say how many days have been dry and how many days have been wet. Now this kind of reinforcement strategies where if they have continuously, let's imagine 3 dry days, they get a small reinforcement which is positive, a praise to sometimes a small gift. All of those things can help the child develop healthy reinforcement strategies and work on these things. So that's useful to give tips on these strategies. Of course, we can also go ahead to deal with more intensive treatment. When you're talking about more intensive treatment, we have medications. Now, imipramine was tried much earlier, but because of side effects, it's better avoided nowadays, which is the drug of choice, which is considered here. Desmopressin is the drug, which is drug of choice for non-organic enuresis patients. It also can be given sometimes when, like for example, these are kids who might have a night outs or they have to go and stay with in the hostel, or they're doing a overnight travel where they cannot have this bedwetting episodes. In those kind of episodes, they use desmopressin spray in order to have dry days on that particular day. Apply it on that day and then they kind of move on. So desmopressin is a drug of choice strategy for handling non-organic enuresis. Now, other than medication, you can also use the strategy which is also explained here in this question, which is nothing but bell and pad. What happens in this bell and pad strategy is they will wear undergarments which has a particular sensor, and the moment it starts becoming wet, it gives a sensor and an alarm starts ringing. or vibrating. This alarm which starts ringing and vibrating, which most probably is near the chest or the neck area, kind of awakens the child from its sleep and makes them go to the restroom. So this bed and bell and pad based conditioning is another strategy which is useful. Now, what is the treatment plan for this patient, they've asked. Pharmacotherapy from imipramine is not a great strategy with so much side effects. You would not go for. Psychodynamic psychotherapy is a long-term therapy which is typically done for patients who have psychological conflicts and their own issues in terms of conflicts in their identity and their own well-being and ego, all those stuff. So that's a long drawn process and nothing to do with this bedwetting generally. Bladder training definitely is one of the most important initial treatment strategies. Bell and pad also is a useful strategy. So both are useful. But what should be the treatment here? Now, some of the students have recalled this question to be as, what is the initial treatment plan or what is the first step? Now, first step or initial treatment plan is, I think, most probably the correct recall of it. So if that's right, I think I would definitely psychoeducate and do some bladder training and those, explain the child about how to kind of handle themselves and have healthy habits of clearing their bowel and bladder regularly. With this kind of strategy, it is much better compared to a more intensive strategy, which is bell and pad strategy or the medications which are there. So I think choice C is the best answer for this question. Next question, a male patient lost his job recently. Okay, he's irritable and sad most of the times. He's thinking about the future, gave him worries, and he feels irritated towards his family members. He occasionally went to watch movies with his friends and was able to enjoy it to some extent. Once he returns home, the similar symptoms come up. And what is the diagnosis? Now, please remember, why have they given this point here? Able to enjoy it. Please remember, if it is depression, patients will have anhedonia. If it is depression, patients will have anhedonia. Loss of pleasure from previously pleasurable activities. And please remember, depression should be always pervasive. Pervasive means what? In all scenarios, the patient should continue to be feeling depressed. That's when we call it as pervasive. Understood? It has to be there always. And there should be anhedonia, which is very classical of depression. By giving this statement, the examiner is trying to say, please don't mark anything related to depression. Please don't mark anything related to depression. So examiner has already told that. With this kind of a question, you need to understand what is the recently lost his job. Recently is what is given. Some students recalled it as 1 week, something like that. Now, if at all it was given as 1 week, then automatically generalized anxiety disorder will go away because you require at least 6 months of symptoms to diagnose generalized anxiety disorder. And generalized anxiety disorder has what? Basically, free floating anxiety will be there. Muscle tension and muscle restlessness will be there. They also will have an inability to relax. Inability to relax. So this is not the one. Here, there is an event which has happened after which the patient is having some difficulty. So what do you think is the answer? Is it adjustment disorder or is it mixed anxiety with depression? Now, as I already told you, since we cannot diagnose depression because the patient is able to enjoy some of the activities and still able to do some of the things, and most of his irritability is related to the specific situation, I think with such a major event, we would still diagnose it as adjustment disorder. We know adjustment disorder is something which generally lasts up to 6 months and goes away within 6 months of time. From the life event, within 6 months, adjustment disorder symptoms will go away. Adjustment disorder is much more milder compared to what you see in depression or anxiety disorders. So here, the symptoms are more suggestive of a milder problem and a very short duration after life event. So adjustment disorder is a better choice in the given choices which is given here. Getting it? Students recall different versions of it, so answers might vary. But for this question here, this is the best answer. Let me highlight a few important points for us to know, because a lot of MCQs get framed in and around this area and students get confused always. Now, if you take a life event has happened at a particular point of time, within 2 days, you generally have acute stress reaction. Nowadays, this is no more considered as a disorder, okay, because it's very brief and comes and goes. They don't diagnose it as a separate disorder. It's just a acute stress reaction, which is less than 2 days. From 2 days to 1 month, we call it as acute stress disorder. Acute stress disorder. From 2 days to 1 month duration. It is almost like PTSD symptoms, symptoms can happen, but only up to 1 month. Why? Because if it is more than 1 month, we have the diagnosis of PTSD. For you to diagnose PTSD, you should at least have more than 1 month of symptoms, right? PTSD, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 alphabets. Please remember, 4 weeks of symptoms should be at least there for you to diagnose PTSD. What requires 2 weeks of symptoms? 2 weeks of symptoms. Depression, right? Depression requires 2 weeks of symptoms. Do you know OCD? OCD also requires for you to diagnose 2 weeks of symptoms, okay? Which is out of context here, but I'm just telling you because that is also tested in exam. Which is this condition we are talking about, which is less than 6 months duration? As I just mentioned when I was talking to you in the previous slide, adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorder is a condition which lasts less than 6 months time. Something which can go beyond 6 months. Have you heard of chronic grief? Have you heard of chronic grief? That is grief which persists beyond 6 months. That's more than 6 months. A condition which can last more than 2 years. Can you guess which is the condition which can last more than 2 years? Dysthymia. Dysthymia and cyclothymia. Correct? So, by just looking at the duration, you can answer many of these related questions and you can see whether there is a stressful event or not. Now, you need to know an interesting point here. When you're talking about stressful event, there are some conditions in psychiatry which requires a stressful event. Which are the conditions in psychiatry which requires a stressful event? Acute stress reaction, acute stress disorder, PTSD, adjustment disorder. These conditions specifically require an event to have happened and it triggers of the problem. Depression, even though people believe you should have some reason to get depressed, you need to understand classically in depression, you many times will not find a specific precipitating factor. In fact, in many patients, you might see physical illnesses like some fever episode or some other physical health issue would have come in, after which they would get into a depressive episode. So you need to know in psychiatry, these are some specific conditions which requires a life event's presence. Acute stress reaction, acute stress disorder, PTSD, adjustment disorder. Whereas depression need not always have a precipitating factor. So when you're talking about symptoms of these conditions, you know acute stress reaction is nothing but like a shock-like state. Acute stress disorder is PTSD kind of symptoms, but less than 1 month, whereas PTSD is more than 1 month. What kind of symptoms will you see in PTSD? Again, you will see hyperarousal, you will see avoidance behavior, you will see flashbacks, nightmares, sleep disturbance. That's how classically PTSD patients come, right? What do you see in adjustment disorder? Basically, mild anxiety or mild depressive symptoms will be there. You will never be able to diagnose full-fledged anxiety or depression in them because it's pretty mild in them, in adjustment disorder. Whereas in depression, you know, at least 2 weeks of symptoms, it should be pervasive in those. What is dysthymia? Dysthymia is chronic, mild depressive state. It is not necessarily even mild, but it is little less than mild, but chronically present for how long? More than 2 years duration. That's when you diagnose dysthymia. So what is the answer for this question? The answer for this question is adjustment disorder, because this patient doesn't have a full-fledged depression episode, so we cannot diagnose depression as such, and it is just happened after he has lost his job, so he's possibly in layman's term getting kind of adjusted with these challenges which have happened after losing their job. So let's talk about the next question here. A 10-year-old child is suffering from selective mutism. He is probably suffering from what? Selective mutism. Now, what do you mean by mute? Mute means silent, right? So, selective silence. What does it mean? It basically means the child is able to talk in many places normally, but in some specific places, the child is completely mute and unable to talk. That is what is called as selective mutism. For you to say somebody is having selective mutism, these symptoms should be lasting for more than 1 month at least. The problem with selective mutism is, let's imagine the child is playful, talkative in every sphere, but when it goes to the class, let's imagine math class, the child stops talking. Whatever teacher asks, a simple question, how much is 1 plus 1 man? The child doesn't answer. But the child can do everything else correctly. So the teacher might get very upset that the child is able to do everything else. Why is it not able to talk? So that could be an example of selective mutism which is persistent. And this persistence you should not be able to explain by any other condition like autism or depression or anxiety or any other condition. Then only you diagnose it as selective mutism. Now you tell me, use your common sense and tell, when could a child have selective mutism most commonly? When do you think a child would become silent in some particular circumstances? Take your example. Most of you, when you go to an unfamiliar place or a new place, do you start talking easily? No, right? Some of us are a little inhibited. We take some time to kind of warm up. So selective mutism very commonly can happen because of anxiety. Of course, it can also happen because of depression. Sometimes it can happen because of psychosis, but very common comorbid problem is anxiety. In fact, one of the very important comorbid problem we should always look at is social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder, which is a very common anxiety disorder, which can be seen in children. If you can pick it up early, you can intervene, teach the child a lot of behavioral strategies to kind of come out of the social anxiety problem. So picking up selective mutism is extremely important. So out of the given choices, what do you think the child is suffering from? Is it childhood depression, childhood psychosis, childhood anxiety disorder, or hyperkinetic disorder? Before you choose the answer, you should rule out this for sure. In hyperkinetic disorder, what can happen? Over familiarity can happen. Children can talk disinhibited. So even with strangers, they start talking very easily. They kind of get into arguments. They kind of start making jokes the moment they meet even unfamiliar people. So that is the issue in hyperkinetic disorder. So that's removed here. Any of these things can happen, but psychosis is much less common. Depression is also less common. Anxiety, as I told you, is the most important comorbid problem which happens with selective mutism. So any child who presents to your clinic, you could be a pediatrician or you could be a general physician, and a child would be brought to you by the parent telling, sir, this child is very intelligent, very capable, he does everything, but when he goes to school, there is this particular class or teacher, he doesn't open his mouth, he keeps quiet. The teacher keeps scolding, the teacher thinks he is wantedly doing it, he is naughty boy. But we know he is always talking normally, only here he becomes silent. So that's an example of selective mutism which could be happening in these children. And you know, when this persists for a long time, it can cause its own problems. Now, one unusual thing in this question is they're given 10-year-old, right? But please remember, most of the times we see children with selective mutism anywhere between 2 to 4 years of age. In fact, when they enter into the school, 5 to 10 years is the time when we see. So it is a little late age to find out and diagnose selective mutism, but still, you need to understand it's much more common in very young children between 2 to 4 years of age, where selective mutism is much more commoner. Moving to the next question, a psychotic patient developed voluntary, purposeless movements. Once observed standing still for hours, has waxy flexibility. What is the appropriate medical management is the question. What is the appropriate medical management? What condition are they talking about here? The person is standing still for long hours, has some posturing, has some waxy flexibility, some purposeless movements. What do you think is the condition we are talking about? I guess you guessed it right. Catatonia, right? Please understand, catatonia now in the current status in DSM and ICD-11 and DSM-5, it's a separate diagnosis which is made now. Earlier, catatonia would be coming under affective disorders or schizophrenia as part of psychotic symptom. But now it's a separate diagnosis which is made. Why? Because catatonia could be because of many reasons. One of the common reasons is affective disorders. Affective disorders, basically depression. When there is severe depression, patients can get into catatonic state, or when patients are into severe manic symptoms, they get into catatonic state. Another common reason why catatonia develops is schizophrenia patients. Schizophrenia patients. Understood? Another example for developing catatonia is organic conditions. Organic conditions. Delirium patients can present in catatonia. Frontal lobe tumor patients can present in catatonia. Patients with encephalopathy can present in catatonia. So different organic conditions can also present in catatonia. So anybody who comes with catatonia now gets a separate diagnosis of catatonia. You always rule out organic conditions. Then you try to see whether it is any of the psychiatric conditions and treat them. Understood? What are the features you should look for to say catatonia is there? There are many features which you can see for. Some of the important features which a lot of people miss is decreased oral intake. A simple feature of decreased oral intake is an important feature of catatonia. Incontinence is an important feature of catatonia. Waxy flexibility, which is given in the exam, right? Exam question also. Waxy flexibility is an important feature. When you're moving the patient's hand or leg, the movement will be almost like a waxy feeling will be there. That is called as waxy flexibility. You can also have other important features like psychological pillow. What is a psychological pillow? They've asked a few times in exam. Do you remember? See, for example, if this is the bed, the patient's head will be little raised up. The head will be little raised up because the patient believes there is an imaginary pillow. There will be no pillow, but he believes there is a pillow and his head would be little raised up from the bed. So there is a gap between his head and the bed. That is called a psychological pillow, which is sometimes seen in patients with catatonia. You can have abnormal posturing. You can have Gegenhalten, Mitmaschen, all those kind of features. You can look into video on psychopathology and schizophrenia where I have spoken about catatonia for you to understand it much better. Now, when you're talking about management, you need to understand catatonia, right? Simple way to remember is like this. So when you're talking about catatonia, two important management strategies are there. One is giving ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Another strategy is using lorazepam. Understood? So these are two important strategies to handle catatonia. ECT is electroconvulsive therapy and lorazepam is useful. Now lorazepam is a drug which is so responsive in patients with catatonia that when you give lorazepam within 24 to 48 hours, most of these patients will have significant reduction in catatonic symptoms. In fact, many of these patients will have complete remission of these catatonic symptoms when lorazepam is given. So the answer for this question is, what is the best medical management strategy? You need to understand lorazepam. What is the other way of managing catatonia? ECT. Let me highlight an interesting point here. Schizophrenia is there, right? Schizophrenia typically is not a condition which will be treated with ECT unless patients have catatonic symptoms or significant affective symptoms, that is manic or depressive symptoms, or the patients are extremely suicidal. That is the only time when we use ECTs in schizophrenia. So one of the places where we use is when patients have catatonia, where ECTs are indicated. Getting it? So that is also something which can be tested in exam. Next question. Which of the following features differentiate delirium from dementia in Alzheimer's disease? Please remember, a lot of elderly people, that is dementia patients, can at some points of time even develop delirium. Getting it? So how do you differentiate delirium from dementia? How do you differentiate delirium from dementia? Acuity of onset and agitation. Is that the way to differentiate? Acuity of onset and loss of consciousness. Is that the way to differentiate? Visual hallucinations, impaired memory, agitation, irritation. So how do you differentiate is the question. Please remember, For you to understand this, let's highlight this important point here. Delirium is an emergency or a serious condition. Whenever you're walking on the street and you see an ambulance going, you should remember delirium, delirium, delirium. It should come to your head. Delirium is an acute emergency serious condition. So it's an acute emergency or a serious condition. If you don't diagnose patients with delirium and treat the underlying cause, the mortality of these patients could be very, very high. Sometimes it can go even up to 60% when it is undiagnosed and untreated. So it's important for us to diagnose them and find the underlying cause and treat them. Delirium can happen for hell a lot of reasons, because of degenerative conditions, metabolic encephalopathies, infections, systemic problems. You can have many conditions, drug toxicities, drug withdrawal states. All of them can lead to delirium, right? So delirium is just kind of a symptom of an underlying issue. So you should find out. And it is the most common organic condition. It is the most common organic condition with which patients present. Okay, so it is not dementia. The most common organic condition we see is delirium. So how do you differentiate delirium from dementia? A lot of students read some huge list of table and try to remember those things. Please remember, ambulance is related to delirium, whereas dementia is a chronic condition. It requires at least 6 months of symptoms for you to diagnose dementia. For you to clinically diagnose this person is having dementia, you should be seeing symptoms for at least 6 months. Now use common sense. Would a patient in emergency roam around for 6 months in ambulance? Absolutely not, right? So when the question comes 6 years, 3 years, 1 year, 2 years, mostly they are talking about dementia. Whereas if the question comes last 24 hours, last 72 hours, last 48 hours, if those kind of questions come, then most probably they are talking about delirium. So delirium is an acute emergency condition. Next important point you need to understand is delirium patients will have disorientation or confusion, or they will have altered sensorium. Now this is very important core feature of delirium. Now dementia patients, because of the memory issues, might not be able to remember the person correctly, time correctly, and those. But here it's an active problem where they have disorientation to time, place, person. They can be confused. They can have altered sensorium. You can see similar kind of features in dementia, but the core feature which has to be there in every patient with delirium is what? All these features. Understood? Memory problems can happen in delirium as well as dementia. In delirium as well as dementia. Especially in delirium, new learning is very commonly affected. New learning abilities could be very commonly affected. So if the delirious patient is there in your ward for last 3 days, you might not remember who all came to meet him in the last 3 days. That's a common problem with delirium patients. So with this understanding, let me go to this question and try to help you to answer this question. Which of the following features differentiate delirium from dementia? I've just given few crucial points about dementia and delirium. So let's try to answer. Acuity of onset. See, obviously, right, acuity of onset is an extremely important thing which will say whether it is delirium or dementia. Delirium is acute emergency condition, dementia is chronic condition. Acuity of onset and agitation is what they've given. Here, acuity of onset and loss of consciousness is what is given, which is nothing but altered sensorium, right? Or disorientation or confusion in simple terms. Now, choice C is visual hallucinations and impaired memory. Visual hallucinations can be seen in dementia patients as well as in delirium patients. Impaired memory can happen in both, as I already told you. Agitation and irritation can happen to all, including people who are watching this video. If it's getting prolonged, you might get agitated and irritated. So that's a very non-specific symptom. So what do you think is the core answer? I don't need to tell you, right? I'm sure you'll mark it as this one. Acuity of onset and loss of consciousness. Better word rather than loss of consciousness is altered sensorium, or altered consciousness is a better word rather than loss of consciousness, which is important feature to delineate delirium from dementia. please understand, a lot of elderly people, especially with dementia, will get into delirious episodes and come out of it. So they can go hand in hand in many clinical scenarios. So the last question for us to discuss here is, a patient was treated with TCA, which is nothing but tricyclic antidepressants, for a major depressive episode in hospital for 4 weeks. What is the main concern while considering his discharge, they've asked. So it's a very nice way of putting across a question to see whether you think really about the pharmacology as well as the clinical aspects of a drug. Now, they've asked, what is the concern? Is suicide risk a concern? Is ECG monitoring for arrhythmias a concern? A drug monitoring is required? Sedation being the side effect. What is the concern you look at? Now, please understand, the patient has already been admitted for depression and is been in hospital for about 4 weeks. Okay? And after 4 weeks, the person is getting discharged. So what is your major concern, they've asked. Now, it makes you think on 2 lines. You need to be thinking about suicide and its relation to antidepressants, and also understand some risk factors in relation to suicide and admissions. So please understand, when you're talking about suicide and antidepressants, typically what is the major factor which leads to suicide? Depression. So antidepressants should always help patients to get away from depression, which basically means they should prevent suicide. But unfortunately, to make it complicated, there is a situation called as paradoxical suicide. Now, what is this paradoxical suicide? Paradoxical suicide happens when antidepressants are started. When you start antidepressants many times, there can be increase in suicidal thoughts or ideas. The suicidal thoughts or ideas can increase in the patient. Because there is an increase in the suicidal thoughts or ideas, sometimes because they kind of start sleeping well, and those, sometimes their energy is little more there and they're a little more activated. Because of the increasing ideas and activation, it can lead to increased suicidal behavior. Increase in suicide. Now, immediately don't become very worried. Oh my God, don't start patients on antidepressants. Patients will have increased suicide risk. Please understand, majority of them will respond well and they might actually be benefited by the antidepressants. Small number of people, you should be looking for worsening of suicidal thoughts. In those people, you should stop that agent and shift to a different antidepressant. That's the strategy which we need to follow. Please remember, paradoxical suicide is also something which they asked a couple of years back in an All India exam. Now, when you're talking about suicide, you need to know there are 2 drugs in psychiatry which can reduce the risk of suicide. Can you guess? That's also asked in exam. Please remember, lithium and clozapine. Lithium and clozapine are 2 important drugs which are used, which can reduce the risk of suicide. Otherwise, some of the antidepressants, especially when you begin the dosage and all, it can increase the risk of suicide. Now, when you're talking about suicide and admission, you need to understand there are studies to say post-discharge, there is an increase in the risk of suicide. Post-discharge, there is an increase in the risk of suicide. Why could it be happening? One of the reasons could be that the patients, once they reach home, they stop taking their medicines regularly, they become non-compliant, worsening of symptoms, and it could lead to suicidal risk. Second thing is also that maybe sometimes these patients behave as if they are getting better, and which means you prematurely discharge them and they go ahead and act on their suicidal thoughts which might be there in their heads. Or most probably, once they go back to the mainstream society, their stress levels increases and they're not able to handle. So there could be multiple reasons for their increase in risk. So you should be careful, especially once somebody gets discharged. In the initial few days, it's a good idea to monitor. And many times, patients might be taking medications by themselves. So by forgetting, accidentally or intentionally, they might overdose themselves with the medication. So with this kind of a knowledge, so let's go back to this question. Tricyclic antidepressants is one of the drugs which is known to cause a lot of side effects, right? It can cause anticholinergic side effects, it can cause arrhythmias, it can cause QT prolongation and those. So ECG monitoring becomes important. But a lot of these issues starts off very early, not after 4 weeks. It starts off pretty early, arrhythmias and those. You look for it right in the beginning itself when you're hiking up the dosage. Drug monitoring for TCA is not necessarily required, other than the fact that you monitor, if you're worried about suicidal behaviors, you want to give the patient access to medication in limited amounts, or you ask somebody else to monitor the intake of the medication. Drug monitoring in psychiatry, mostly well-known practice is for lithium, where you do serum lithium levels, right? Other than that, clinically, other than sometimes anti-epileptic drugs where they look for like serum anti-epileptic levels, you don't use this drug monitoring strategy clinically in day-to-day basis other than serum lithium levels. Sedation is a side effect. Most of the times, sedation would be very high in the initial few days, and generally patients become tolerant with these kind of side effects most of the times as days go by. So after 4 weeks or so, it might be lesser concern than in the initial few days. So what is the answer for this question? Suicidal risk. 2 reasons. Tricyclic antidepressants overdosing could be very lethal. Another thing is patient after 4 weeks is getting discharged. All of this points out that you should be careful about this patient if suicidal risk and possibility of acting on suicidal thoughts if they have any. So requesting the family members to closely monitor and have limiting the access to lethal means. These are potential strategies by which we could help these patients, and explaining the family members that any change in their behaviors, they need to come back immediately, is an extremely important method by which we can prevent these kind of problems which can happen post-discharge. So before we wind up, let's talk about this important thing, preparing for the whole paper. Now, a lot of faculties would have given their ideas on how to prepare for the exam, how to revise, right? I'll try to tell you some things which is very practical and useful, and especially if you are a student who is not well prepared but wants to give a very serious thought on in the next few months and see how you can get the maximum out of the few weeks left. This is the way to go by. Prepare for the whole paper. For example, let's imagine I decide to read biochemistry for next 5 days. What happens? I am preparing just for about 15 to 20 questions in the paper which might come in the exam, right? So next 5 days goes only for that. Imagine I do it in a different way. I try to solve a proportion, a percentage of the paper. Let's imagine I am willing to solve 50 MCQs from different subjects, all the 19 subjects in different proportion. 2 questions in anatomy, 2 questions in physiology, 1 question in biochemistry. Like that, if I take a complex proportion of these and I'm trying to solve, what happens is I'm addressing the whole paper because different subjects are addressed. What happens is I'm preparing for the whole paper rather than one part of paper. That's useful strategy, especially when you have limited time. So try to focus on this strategy of reading one basic revision unit, which is 50 questions or odd, which is spread over all the subjects rather than trying to read subject wise. Now the point here is, if you do these cycles once, twice, thrice a day, you might actually be touching upon huge amount of subjects in different areas. Now you might wonder, sir, will it not lead to confusion? Please understand, in exam, nobody is going to ask you first question from first chapter, second question from second chapter. Any question can come from any chapter and any subject. You have to learn in a scattered way. That's unfortunately or fortunately the way which will also be tested in exam. So prepare for the whole paper rather than just preparing for one part of the thing. Biochemistry, by the way, is given here as an example. You can take any other subject for that matter. Revise smartly. One of the biggest mistakes students do is they open the book and start revising the topics. Okay, I know this, I know this, I know this, I know this, I know this. So that's not the right way to revise. You need to do active recall. How do you do active recall? You close your books. You don't have any book. You sit upright and then try to recall. Okay, I remember these are the enzymes which play a role in this. Okay, I remember these are the receptors which play a role in this. I remember these are the complications of this condition. I remember these are the different surgical interventions. So you close and you recall. You close and recall the image which you would have seen and try to make some points like that. That is what is called as active revision, not by seeing the book and saying, okay, I remember this. Because when you see, you're falsely telling that you might remember. But in exam, you don't have any cues, right? You have to recall by yourself. So look for active recall strategy. Don't go for passive recall strategy. Don't cheat yourself. Next important point is build routines. Please remember, as a psychiatrist, one of the biggest problem which I've seen is a lot of students send me message telling, sir, I'm a good student. I used to score very well in mock exams and those. On the exam day, I got anxious and I didn't know what to do. And they would have developed their own strategies. What they would have done, because they want to sleep well previous day, they will take a benzodiazepine by themselves, self-medicate themselves. Or the last few weeks, they take some medication to sleep better. Now, the point here you need to understand is, you know your exam will tentatively happen in the morning hours, and you know how many hours is your exam, 3.5 hours, depending on which exam you're talking about, right? So if you know that's the way, why don't you, when you give grand tests and mocks and those, develop those routines right from the beginning, learning to sit for such long duration, learning to kind of answer in one stretch such a long duration. Building routines is extremely important. Many a times when we say sleep well, eat well, people say, I have no time. Please understand, if you don't have time for the most important things of life, you might end up having no time for things which you're supposed to be doing, and it might cost you significantly a lot. You can postpone reading by few hours, but if you postpone some crucial things to take care of yourself, the payment, the price you pay will be very huge. So be careful. So build routines. Try to, if you have a grand test which you have to give on a particular day, try to take it seriously. Sit down as if you're going to do your real exams and give it in one full stretch as you do your real exams. Even if you have other alternatives to do. Why? Because these routines will help you on that day. And it will be a great idea for you to give grand tests in the same hours where you expect your exams to happen. Now, you might say, sir, we don't know, they might give an afternoon session or something. If you're so confused, one grand test in the morning, one grand test in the afternoon. Like that, you can practice different mocks. But develop routines is what I could say. And the routines should be so comfortable. Like students, imagine you're a person who answers only 80% of the paper because you want to answer only questions which you're very confident about. Now, are you going to practice the same strategy in the exam day is the question. In the exam day, you'd say, oh my God, if I answer only 280 questions, I'm not going to qualify. I have to go 290 plus. So let me guess more. If you're going to do that on exam day, you're going to fail miserably. So learn your routine. See what works for you. What works for the other toppers might not work for you. What works for other average people might not work for you. You need to find out what's your routine and build your routine. That might take you to the next highest level. Thank you.